When we were talking about the topic and the theme for our presentation today, I couldn't help but fall for the old John Wanamaker quote. While most people have heard it before, it still felt like a great place to start. So this well-respected retailer and marketer openly admitted that he felt like half of what he spent on marketing was wasted, but he just didn't know which half. You really think about that and just how impactful that could be. What if you truly put your full marketing spend to work? It felt ironic to me since he's often considered one of the founding fathers or leaders of marketing and advertising. So I thought a good way to get us going today was to start to decouple that a little bit. So what is it that led him not to be the best marketer? What was it that led more than half of his marketing spend to ultimately be wasted? So the first place to look is the fact that he was truly marketing in a single channel. And I thought it was fair to let him off the hook for that today because he really didn't have many other channels or options since radio and television and mail advertising all came afterwards, right? So we'll let him off the hook. The problem with that is that it made him too broad of a marketer. So he was ultimately reaching an audience that wasn't necessarily a fit, wasn't necessarily close enough to come to the store. He was limited to the distribution of the newspaper in which he chose to advertise. Next, he really didn't have any data or insight upon which to enhance his advertising. So he didn't know if he was reaching customers or non-customers. He didn't know if he was reaching people who could afford to shop at his stores. He was simply marketing in a vacuum, making that spend and hoping that it worked. And that really connects to the last part. He had really no ability to understand what was working and what wasn't. There was certainly no way at the time to connect that newspaper advertisement to that individual and whether they came to his store and made a purchase. At best, he could make the spend and say, did sales go up in the coming months? But those are some of the challenges that led Mr. Wanamaker not to be as good of an advertiser as he ought to have been. So we fast forward more than 100 years to today. And ironically, not that much has changed. You can see there are a ton more marketing opportunities, more tactics that are available for people. But truly, if you look at that disparity between the gray lines and the colored lines, anytime we lost, okay, we're good. Sorry about that. Anytime that you see a place where there's a gray line, which is our tactic effectiveness, and any time that the tactic effectiveness is greater than the marketing spend, you can see a discrepancy, and it would go so the other way. So what we see is even though we're more than 100 years into the future, we're still having some of the same challenges of effectively utilizing our marketing spend. And ultimately, when we're not effective marketers, there are very dire ramifications that can come from that. I've been keeping this visual going and updating for a number of years now, and it's truly amazing how many really significant companies and well-known brands ultimately reach their demise or are so sick that they're on their deathbed. And part of the reason is because they're spending money and not having it get the return that they need. So we felt like it was a good and somewhat morbid place to go in this presentation to start to understand what are some of the causes of death. Why did so many well-known companies end up in my graveyard, or why are there so many that are breathing their last breath today? Part of it is the marketing spend and not knowing if they're putting it against the best opportunities, but there are other causes as well. So I thought it would be a good next step for us to examine some of those causes of death for these large companies. So the first place that we obviously go, so go back to 2007, and everybody remembers the time when Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone. But I don't think anybody on this webinar had any idea just how significantly it was going to impact our daily lives. It literally changed the way that we consume. It changed the way that we research. It changed the way that we shop. And it changed the capabilities that were in the palm of our hand. Only 7 years later, more advancements come. And again, it's reshaping how we interact with the world around us. So the introduction of the smart speaker or the smart assistant is once again reshaping how consumers consume content, how they interact with marketing, and ultimately how they make purchase decisions. So this is one of the things that's shaping technology, shaping the health of our companies to start with. And the next one that we'll take a look at is really around disruption. So it's not just a technological thing. It's a deeper understanding of the consumer and the needs of the consumer. And so these new disruptive companies have come in and taken their marketplaces by storm because they've listened and adapted to their customers. And you all know who's going to be on the list, right? So Amazon came in and completely reshaped retail and continues to do so at an alarming pace. Netflix came in and turned entertainment on its ear, and all traditional entertainment companies are trying to figure out how do we redesign or reorganize to meet the needs of content today. Uber came in and really put a full frontal attack on the travel business, and how do we connect into that and make it less reduce the amount of friction that's there for consumers, making it easier for them, and doing so put most of their competition in a significantly bad spot. But there's truly no industry that's not at risk. So disruptors are everywhere. Go into a category even like insurance, and you've had the same large companies competing with one another for decades and decades. But new disruptors are coming into the space and re-engineering the process. How do we make it as easy as possible? How do I take a 45-page policy and boil it down to 2 pages? How do I allow for those interactions to be so easy? So it's not just about adapting to the new technology. It's about reorienting to the needs of today's consumers. And so that's really what we're talking about, is our consumer has changed. So regardless of what industry you're in, the people you are trying to sell to, B2B, B2C, it doesn't matter. Their needs have changed because of the technology innovation and because they've learned over time and adapted to those companies that have listened to them and are able to better service them. So one of the first things that did is it changed the consumer journey. So as marketers, we used to think about this as a linear process. We would literally build our marketing touch points or tactics across that linear journey. And you were in a lot of control. So you could dictate what that consumer was doing, and you had a lot of control over them. But because of what we talked about, the role that technology plays and what technology has done to empower that consumer, that has really started to change. We've put in the power of their hands the ability to research product, to read user reviews, to price compare, to look at inventory, to buy product, to do all of those things. And consumers are doing it at an alarming pace. You guys have all seen the numbers, and I'm just baffled that every single time I do the research and look it up, the numbers keep going up and up and up. Can you imagine 80 times a day is the average that we're checking our phone? And a lot of that is used in that research to shopping process. You know, when you look a little further at the millennials, not only are they using that phone, but they're switching devices. They're switching screens between tablets, laptops, phones, smartwatches, etc., 27 times per hour. I mean, it's baffling, the access to information that everyone has, and they're doing so at a very significant rate. 6+ hours a day is how much digital information or content they're actually consuming. And what that ultimately has led to is a power shift. So as I mentioned, when it was the linear journey, the marketer was very much in control and dictated the terms. But because that consumer today is so empowered and so enabled by the technology that they have and the entitlement that they've learned, they now have a lot of that control. And you can see that show up in so many different places. You guys have all seen the Google stats about near me searches, things like that. But look at how that's continuing to evolve. It's not just somebody who's looking for a pizza near me. Now they're looking for a veggie pizza near me that's open now that can deliver in 40 minutes. They're really saying, on my terms, this is how I'm going to make the decision of where I shop. I want to know somebody who's open now. I want to know somebody who accepts credit cards. This is really where the growth is continuing to occur and where we can very clearly see the change in customer journey showing up vividly. But despite all the change that occurs in that customer journey, the one thing that has remained constant is largely where it ends. So we all hear all the news about the growth of e-commerce and how Amazon is the death of retail and things like that. But if you really look at the numbers, we're talking about roughly 91% of all transactions for goods and services occur offline. in a brick and mortar location or by calling a phone number versus happening through e-commerce. So the vast majority of transactions are happening offline. So we've got really dramatically changing journey, but some similarities too that we need to be reminded of. So since that journey is changing so dramatically, it's a mistake to think that we don't have to change our marketing in order to reach the consumers in that different path. We can't expect the journey to have changed, the consumer to change, but to still market like Wanamaker. We need to do something very different than the way that we've done it before, and that's really where we're going to pivot for the rest of my portion of the webinar. So our focus starts with ensuring the strong foundation. We've talked about technology plays a huge role in all journeys today, whether it's B2B, B2C, whether you're looking for a product or service, technology is omnipresent throughout that. But as I also said, the majority of those journeys end in local. They end offline. So what that tells us is that one of the things that's critically important is that key location data that people find as they're going throughout that journey. So a topic that really didn't exist half a dozen years ago is now at the forefront in saying is the foundation of that journey. We have to make sure that the information that we use is correct, that we make available is correct. If you could see in the chart that's up there, and there's countless studies that indicate it, that say when you give incorrect information to a prospective customer, it's one of the greatest deterrents to them becoming your customer. It's one of the greatest ways to really upset them and discourage them from interacting with you in the future. Whether it's a prospect or a current customer, it's a big problem, right? And this data shows up everywhere, whether we're talking about in Google, Google Maps, Google My Business, whether we're talking about the information that shows up in Yelp, whether we're talking about what shows up when somebody's trying to map their way to us. All of these are recipients or the actual data storage or amplifiers themselves, and there's an entire ecosystem that needs this accurate information. And we're talking about things like name, address, phone number, business descriptions, user reviews, photos, videos. These are all elements of your location data and things that we really need to think about and ensure are high quality. Because all of the data shows that it can come off the rails real quick. So if you look at any of the studies where people have found incorrect information, this one by Bright Local is from March and was a great study that they did. We see in almost all cases, at least 25% of the respondents to the survey are saying they've had these negative experiences. They've tried to call a phone number and it was the wrong number that had been listed online. Or they showed up at a business to make a purchase and they were either there before it opened or they showed up after it closed. Or worse yet, they even went to the entirely wrong location because the address and mapping information was incorrect. I'm sure all of you have had some of these similar experiences. And the problem with that is that you're putting business at risk. You are upsetting customers, and that shopping experience, that visit to buy an insurance policy, whatever it is at risk because chances are they're either going to go somewhere else, they're not going to come back, or they're going to find someone else to service their need. So it's really critical that we get the foundation built correctly. The next phase is about really understanding your customer. And this sounds kind of obvious, and many of the marketers that I talk to or work with say, yeah, we know our customer very well. We have 3 segmentations, and we operationalize based on those segmentations. The challenge is, even within a segmentation, customers buy differently. We can't just average out our customer base and assume they're going to respond to the same thing. So in this new world, in this new journey, consumers decide on their own terms where, when, and how they ultimately want to buy. And they're going to raise their hand at multiple times throughout that, and we have to get good at having the data and reading the signals of those. So as I've talked to a lot of clients, it's not that they don't care about the data. It's not that they don't want the data with which to market. It's that they struggle to get access to the data. So they may have multiple business units or organizationally siloed that prevent them from bringing together all of the different data they have. So whether we're talking about point of sale data or their customer data or their email service provider or their DSP or ERP or any other acronym that you can come up with, those are all different sources or silos of data that prevent you from having a holistic view. And so one of the things that we've done, and the reason we're doing this webinar with Search Discovery, is we engage them to help us on this journey. If our clients were struggling to get it right, we wanted to be that centralized hub for them and help them bring together those disparate sources of data and then provide it back to them in an incredibly transparent way. So not only is it helping us be better marketers on behalf of our clients, but it's also us being able to provide a service to our clients who may otherwise struggle to operationalize this. And John will talk much more about this topic as we go on. The next thing, as I mentioned, is about reading the tea leaves, if you will. So how do I understand the intent of my customer and prospect? It's so important, and it's really how do we stop wasting the half of our dollars, half of our marketing budgets by understanding the signals of intent. So what a lot of marketers have done is they've gotten good at understanding the intent behind search. It's pretty obvious. Somebody goes to Google, they type a search, and it's really them raising their hand saying, this is what I'm interested in. So it's why Google has been so successful as a company, is because they're monetizing people raising their hand and making the connection to the marketer. So we got that one down pretty good. The next one that a number of marketers have gotten good at is understanding intent that is expressed through social media. So when somebody's engaging with our content on a regular basis, when somebody is liking things that we say and wanting to connect with us, that's another very clear signal that we have somebody who's interested in something. And as we continue to watch their evolution and what they engage with and what they don't, we have a much clearer understanding of their intent. So that's another area where most marketers are getting really good. The problem is those first two areas that I just mentioned, search and social, in large part lead to e-commerce transactions. So it's very logical. You're online, you continue that through to an online, whether it's opening a bank account, whether it's looking for an attorney, whether it's buying a product, whatever it is, there's a natural connection there. But the problem was, I told you earlier that 90+% of all transactions still happen offline. So by just placing our focus on understanding intent that leads to e-commerce or online transactions, I'm missing about 90% of the opportunity that's out there. So that takes us to the last source of intent, which most marketers haven't gotten really good at yet. It's still a new and emerging space, but it's incredibly important. If you just think about what I just said of the lion's share of transactions occur offline. So where that customer is, where that consumer is physically and within their journey and within a pathway of interacting in the real world is one of the most powerful signals of intent that we can ultimately find. And that helps us truly de-average them. So for example, if that consumer was standing on an auto dealership lot and we saw them at 3 other brands of auto dealership lot, it reasons that they might be in the market to buy a new automotive, which seems like a great time to start talking to them about looking at their insurance policy again, right? If we see somebody routinely stops at Starbucks every day, that could inform the segment even better than what websites did they visit. Where do they actually go in their real world is very important to us, and it helps us de-average that consumer and get even better. So what that says is, the next point, transitioning from thinking broadly, as Wanamaker did, so instead of just buying a newspaper ad and reaching everybody equally, even if we're a national or global advertiser, it becomes incredibly important to act locally, right? So how do I take my marketing budget? How do I take my marketing strategy? And of course, I'm still going to do some global broad reach advertising and branding work. But when I'm truly trying to activate somebody to go do something, like walk into a store or go visit an insurance agent or go into a bank, one of the greatest opportunities we have is to apply those funds on a hyper-local level. So as we transition from the Wanamaker view of that wide reach to getting into that hyper-local focus, it becomes incredibly powerful. And for one of the first times ever, because of the proliferation of mobile devices, we have the opportunity to ultimately do that. Not just looking at a DMA, but getting all the way into a particular neighborhood, because the people who live there are close to your store because they're most likely to do this and so on, all the way down to that individual household, geofencing based on property lines and things like that. And it's about then layering data on top of data to get even more precise in what you're doing. And as I mentioned, the opportunity comes because everybody is carrying around their phone. And the vast majority of people who carry around their phone have location services turned on. not because they don't know, but because they're making the willing decision to share information in order to get value. The example I always share is, I don't want to have to type in my address or search for the local Dunkin' Donuts each morning when I leave my house. I want the Dunkin' Donuts app to know that I'm closest to this particular location. When I go to place my order, it's going to that location. That's huge value, and I'm willing to exchange some privacy in order to get that. And pretty much every other app on my phone, I have that relationship with. And ultimately, therefore, I'm sharing knowingly my information with that marketer in order to be able to reap the benefit of that. So it's that give and take that we get. And what that ultimately allows us to do, and where marketing is truly going, is not just marketing to somebody because of where they're physically standing, but our ultimate goal is to market to them based on where they're going to be. So BrandMuscle, we call that precision marketing. That is the focus of ridding the waste from marketing, so that we can layer all of the real-world insights on top of the typical demographic, psychographic, and behavioral data to really, with precision, reach the best customers at the time in which they're raising their hand, whether through search or social or their physical location, so that we know we're reaching the very best audience. And so if you follow around the map, you know, it's a typical day in a life where you start out at home. You've probably received some communication like via direct mail or via television advertising or things like that. And all along that journey, the marketers are able to interact with you at the appropriate time and in the appropriate way. So I said at the beginning, the new consumer rule is what, when, where, and how they want to be reached by marketers. And so we have those opportunities in every one of these things, like digital radio or search or mobile display or in-app advertisements, or opportunities to encourage behavior and ultimately change behavior based on reaching the right customer and satisfying the particular need that they have. So the last portion that I'll cover ties back to what I said Wanamaker didn't do. So he didn't have the ability to connect his advertisements to the in-store behaviors that he was seeking. We all do, and it's really important that we take advantage of those opportunities and constantly push ourselves and our partners to get better and better and better at that. So I'll steal from another great American businessman, Peter Drucker, and he said, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And so it's exactly what I'm talking about here, which is the importance of measuring what you do, not just so that you can say, yep, I accomplished what I needed to do, but most importantly, so that you can continually optimize that and make that better and better as you go. It should be a process of collecting data and constantly getting smarter and applying that. And again, it's one of the things at BrandMuscle we work really hard to do, is to be very transparent with the data so that our customers have easy access to that information and so that our team can use it from an optimization perspective. And it's got to go more. It's got to continually get better. So if you think very simply about digital advertising, everybody can report on click-through rate, right? And how do you know if that means anything to your business? You can get a lot of clicks off of a lot of impressions, and that could actually do nothing for your business. So we have to evolve and hold to a higher standard. The next level from that, which is good, is what we call micro conversions. So think about all the different points of engagement that a customer can have with us. We can bring them into a website or a microsite, and they could fill out a contact form. They can request more information. They can start a quote. They can call a trackable phone number. They can look up the address to our physical location. All of these things are really important forms of engagement that we absolutely need to track, understand, and optimize against. But it still needs to go even further than that. And so this is where, from an analytic perspective, things are starting to get very exciting. So when you actually take it the last mile and say, did that person who I sought to engage with at all those multiple touch points along their journey, did they actually ever show up in my store, my office, et cetera? Being able to set up those type of conversion zones and say, did they come into that space at the time in which I needed and wanted them to, is very important. And that creates the opportunity from an analytics perspective for us to then go the last mile, which is the hardest part, and which is the part that nobody has truly mastered yet, which is how do I connect into did they then purchase, and how much did they purchase, right? So think about this as a continual journey or evolution that's really important that we constantly push on to continually get better. And so this is one of the areas where we're starting to see some new models emerge. So for example, some of the marketing we're doing at BrandMuscle is based on a cost per visit basis. Did we actually get that person to your particular location? And that's only when you pay as an advertiser. So it's opening up even new models to bring better alignment between marketer and their partners. So that takes us to the important transition point. I've just shared some really interesting opportunities for us to take advantage of so that we ultimately can all avoid the graveyard. I don't want to see any of you show up on my slide in the next year. But you now have to think about how do we get there? So much of what I talked about is about data empowerment and having the right tools and systems in place. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Search Discovery and John, who's going to share a bit of a case study orientation to how they've helped some similar organizations achieve what we've just talked about. John?
Great. Thanks very much, Paul. I appreciate it. So when we first started planning this, we talked about holding your marketing to a higher standard. And for me, I didn't just think about the 50th floor. I immediately went to outer space. So when I thought about this, this is actually a picture of the Hubble telescope. And what Paul talked about with Wanamaker's quote, not knowing where your money goes or if your money's wasted, the Hubble is actually an interesting story about that. So you may or may not know this, but the Hubble originally was funded in the early 1970s, but it didn't actually launch until 1990. So 20 years of development and $1.5 billion was spent to launch this telescope. And when it launched, it didn't work. The pictures were blurry, they weren't getting the images they needed, it was a total disaster. It turned out that there was a flaw in one of the mirrors that caused all of those images to be blurry. This was called a spherical aberration, and the flaw was the size of 1/50th of a piece of paper, sheet of paper. So it was very, very small, but this was causing all of that money to seemingly be wasted. 20 years of development, $1.5 billion, all wasted, or so it seemed. I actually had dinner with a client in Pittsburgh not too long ago, and he corroborated this story. He actually worked at NASA in 1990 and said, this is actually very true, this totally happened. And there was finger pointing going on, people were accusing one another of not doing this right. It took them 3 years to actually resolve the problem. In 1993, NASA sent 7 astronauts to repair the aberration. These were people, trained people, that they were trained to use about 100 specialized tools to make this repair, and it required 5 days of spacewalks and highly technical work. So we had people, they were trying to fix the infrastructure, and once it was completed, the telescope began to actually take the images they had hoped for, and the results were simply breathtaking. This is actually an image of what's called the Lagoon Nebula, and this was taken in April of this year. So 28 years later, we are still discovering galaxies. This is a monster young star, 200,000 times brighter than our sun, and it's located 4,000 light years away. So this was just discovered, but the moral of the story and why I tell this is what seemed like it could have been wasted money required optimization and it required focus. What they had to do was keep their eye on the larger strategy while still delivering results along the way. And that's a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. So as we dig into this, the question I ask of you is, consider whether or not your strategy is gathering dust. A lot of organizations will develop a strategy, but sometimes it does feel like it's 4,000 light years away. It's not actionable, it kind of sits out there, people say, oh yeah, that's our big strategy, but they lose focus, and marketers don't know what to do. Here at Search Discovery, we're changing that paradigm. We're actually doing something very different, and we've developed what we call the Executable data strategy. And this is simply a plan for using data with purpose. So for most companies, what does that mean? Data with purpose. It sounds good, but most companies think about this, that there are some primary drivers of why you're in business and what it takes to stay in business. And really they come down to making money, saving money, and keeping your customers happy. Your big picture strategy should tie to all of these, or at least one of these goals. and your executable strategies become the path in order to how to get there. I like to add one more to this list, and that's data for good. And I put an asterisk there because that's probably not essential for staying in business, but it's something that many companies are working towards today. And just to put a little color around this, for when it comes to marketers, when you think about making money, your executable strategy might be acquiring new customers. Or when it comes to saving money, how are you optimizing your marketing spend? Are you looking at your campaigns while they're in flight and actually shifting dollars to make sure that they're working for you? And then when it comes to happy customers, an executable strategy might be mapping those non-linear customer journeys that Paul talked about to make sure that you're keeping your marketing relevant, to capture them where they are at the right time, at the right place, to make sure that you're executing in that way. But what happens if you're not like most companies? So thinking about, if those aren't your goals, if you're not a retailer, you have to start looking or digging a little deeper. And so first you might start looking at the values. What does your company stand for? You'll also look at your mission. What are you trying to achieve? I can't tell you the number of organizations I've consulted with where they can rattle off their mission statements and talk about their values, and I say, well, what are you doing about it? And that's where they get stumped. They can't answer those questions. So the vision then becomes, how do you get there? This is the hard part, but translating those values and mission into the vision is really where you need to go to get to that executable data strategy. And this vision can be blurry. So here's where I'm going to talk a little bit about a case study that we did with a nonprofit organization, and they're a media company. So they had a strong vision. They knew exactly what they stood for. They knew what their mission was, but their vision was blurry. So we transcribed a whiteboard exercise to be able to show all of the things we were thinking about. We tried to map it to making money, saving money, happy customers. It just didn't work out that way. So we had to get creative. We started to ask questions about what's really important to you, what's driving your strategy, what are you working for, where are you today, and how do you get to where you're headed? We had to ask these tough questions, and we went through brainstorming sessions. It was tough to get there. What we ultimately found was, with these three core elements of their vision, we actually got to what really mattered to them. And it was about, for the audience, it was about connecting audience data and their analysis to the local level. So being able to understand at a corporate level, what are we doing, what are we working towards, and how do we connect that to the local level? The next one was sustainability, was building a scalable solution around data and analytics. It had to extend to all their local stations. It had to be able to work, not just at a corporate scale, but on the local scale as well. And then for delivering the mission, it was defining an impact on that mission. So this was tough to arrive at. This seemed simple, but getting to this point required countless interviews. We had brainstorming sessions. We had negotiations. There was compromise, but they couldn't see it themselves. It required them stepping back. They were too close to it. And we had to sort through all these details to be able to get to what really mattered with their vision. So once we had that vision, once we agreed on it, we had to plan out how to get here. And this is where we start to talk about the desired outcomes. So the way that we at Search Discovery think about desired outcomes, there's three simple questions you need to ask. The first is, what are we trying to achieve? And this should be a clear, pithy definition of what the organization is working towards. And by the way, this doesn't require data or metrics. You should be able to answer this question. And if you can't, go back and revisit, because what are you working towards should be simplistic. And every marketer is going to have a different approach. An operations person is going to have a different answer to this question. Each person within your organization may answer differently, and that's okay. Those are going to be different desired outcomes. But the next stage is to say, once you understand what you're working towards, what high-level business objectives does this support? And these are the corporate mission or the goals. So in this case study example, it was the audience, the sustainability, and the mission. But ultimately, how do you know if you're successful? And this is the key question. These are the strategic measures of success. And they're going to, to do this, you need to focus back on the answer to the first question and look at it in the context of what metrics are we going to use to measure and what targets should we be working towards. So here again, kind of to reiterate what Paul said, this is what Wanamaker didn't have. He didn't have the ability to measure. He didn't have the targets. He was just blasting and praying, we can do better today. And that's holding your marketing to a higher standard, is to be able to understand, how are you going to be successful? What are you working towards? So what did this look like for our nonprofit organization? We started with these 3 questions, and we identified a series of desired outcomes. There were 5 of them. And these desired outcomes span both their operational group as well as their marketing groups. So things like creating efficiency, that was operational. We had to make sure that we were efficient within the corporate teams to be able to support all the rest of the organization and the local stations. Delivering analysis, improving the team dynamics, governing all of that data that they had, and then ultimately supporting the local stations became incredibly important as well. So the objectives, we talked about these already, but each one of them supports either one or more of those objectives that we identified. So audience, sustainability, and mission, we can point to each one of these that the desired outcomes are going to support. And then the measures of success, these are the bullet points, but we actually had hard metrics that we were going to use, and we had definitive targets. So as you think about this, these desired outcomes, they may be specific to marketing, but for your company, they could extend to sales, to your HR department, to finance, to logistics. Really, wherever you're working towards and wherever you're collecting and utilizing data, you can apply this principle of the desired outcomes. So once we have the desired outcomes mapped out, just knowing what they are, that's really only the first step in the process. Then we started to plan out a roadmap. How do we get there? What are the specific tasks and objectives that we need to achieve to be able to make these things a reality? And much like the customer path today or the customer journey, it's not linear. Today's roadmap does not start at point A and end at point Z in a straight line. There are multiple paths. So in this example here, creating efficiency, we had a series of specific tasks that we had to go through. The first one that you see there, E1, we had to audit their data. We had to make sure that they were collecting the right data, that what we thought we were getting is what we actually had. And then when we progress through, there were other activities. The fourth one there was selecting a business intelligence platform. We were working up to that. We couldn't even select the platform until we had efficiencies created for how are we going to audit the data, what are we going to do with it, how do we get the right systems in place, ultimately leading up to selecting that platform. The next desired outcome was delivering analysis. So here we started with A1, it was evaluating the data to set baselines and targets. So we look back at the historic analytics data, at their marketing data, at their transactional data to understand what good looked like. And then we could say, here's our benchmarks, and here's what we're working towards with any given campaign. And when we bumped up to the next one, that intersection there, we wanted to be able to automate the reporting. So we wanted to be able to say, how are we going to do this? How are we going to automate the reporting to be able to become more efficient? And that's where that intersection came to play. We were delivering analysis and we were creating efficiencies. Therefore, these paths ran concurrently and we were getting multiple benefits out of them. In a similar way, when it came to improving the team dynamics, the first one was building out the expertise and the skills of our team. But then as we worked our way up, the fourth one there, that was really about aligning analysts to support the local stations. So we have a BI platform. We were now aligning our analysts within the corporate structure to be able to support their local stations. So they were dedicated, they were doing analysis, they were helping them, feeding them recommendations, and these things mapped to one another. Governance then came into play. So while all this is going, we were setting up a governance council. That was establishing what the protocol was, how we were going to govern data, how we were going to talk about data. The second piece there was creating the playbook. So we made a playbook to say, this is what we have, this is how you can utilize it, this is what you'll have access to, and here's the marketing that you can deliver based on all of these things together. And then finally, when we layer in the local support, the first one, we had to educate the local stations. We had to build awareness to tell them what was happening. But then we talked about, after we did that, we gave them the playbook and we educated them about the playbook. And then as we went further, we said, we're going to have analysts to support you. And ultimately, we got to the benchmarks and targets, which they were going to be working against. So all of these things together, they were running concurrently, but this is what our roadmap looked like. It wasn't that linear plan that you may have seen in past roadmaps or that strategy that's gathering dust. These are our executable strategies at work and in play. And they're all moving in different directions, but they all have intersection points where they're building and growing off one another. So let's talk a little bit about how to do this. You need an ecosystem. Simply achieving these things doesn't happen overnight. You have to build the competencies, you have to build many different components to be able to get there. So when we think about building this data and analytics ecosystem, it starts with that vision. And your vision gets focused by establishing those business outcomes that we talked about. So that's the way that you work towards it. But the elements, so the executable data strategy determines how to enable the ecosystem to achieve those desired outcomes. So what does that mean? When we look at this, the ecosystem has data, it has infrastructure, it's got people, it's got process. And it also has governance, which is the glue that ties all of this together. So your ecosystem consists of lots and lots of data, multiple pieces of infrastructure, many different people with different skills and resources, and specific process to be able to enable things to get done. But the fact of the matter is, every business outcome is going to use different parts of this ecosystem. So when you look at this, for outcome number 2, we might be using different chunks of data, we may be using a different infrastructure pieces, and think about this as your technology. So maybe if you're going direct or trying to email your customers or your prospects, you're using your marketing automation or your emailing software to be able to get to them. You're also using your analytics data to know what content they looked at. You've got the right people who are experts in SEO and optimization that are going to work on specific desired outcomes. And then you've got your process about perhaps how you work with your external or third-party agencies. So this ecosystem then becomes this collection of tools and resources that you're utilizing at different points. So to put a little more color behind this, so within our case study here, this is the desired outcome of supporting local. For this organization, we had lots of different data. We had Nielsen data, their Nielsen Grace Note. We had Google Analytics. We were using Google BigQuery, Facebook, ComScore information. We were using Excel. When we looked at all this, we had to figure out how do we put it together? Where do we store that data? What types of transformations need to occur? How do we visualize it? And ultimately, how do we share it? So these were the infrastructure components. And for this particular organization, it was about being able to fully manage the APIs and the connections, being able to use multiple data upload methods because there were different sources. Some of them required batch processing. Other of them could be APIs. We had to figure out how all that came together within our infrastructure. And ultimately, the capability to join disparate data sets. The people component here, we had corporate, we had stakeholders, and we had local stations that we were working to support. We had to define their roles, we had to establish their permissions, and make sure that they were certified data literate to be able to understand and appreciate this information. And then the process came into play. So for them, it was about developing campaigns, making sure that they had the right KPIs and the targets, and being able to use the reporting and the ad hoc analysis to understand what's happening. This gave the local stations the support and visibility they needed, but it also gave corporate the roll-up so they could do comparisons across different geographies and different regions to be able to understand how their entire portfolio was working. And then finally, governance. So governance, as I mentioned, is the glue that holds it all together. Governance is things like data quality auditing, certifying data sets, understanding the data frequency and the refresh rates, to be able to do alerting if something wasn't happening, using data dictionaries and documentation to understand what exactly they had, having that governance council that I mentioned, and also mitigating bias. You know, in a lot of cases we found that when you just let data out there, people will use it with reckless abandon. So the ability to be able to say, let's make sure that you're using this responsibly and in the way that it was intended becomes very important as well. So the key takeaways here, when I talk about the executable data strategy, it's really a plan for using data with purpose. And that plan includes understanding your data, architecting it to make it useful, and activating it for business impact. So one of the things as you think about this that I challenge you to do is question your data strategy. Don't just take my word for it, but really examine your call to action is to take a look at how well you're doing this. And we break it down into these 3 key components: understanding your data, architecting that data, and activating it. When it comes to understanding the data, what types of data do you have and what types do you need? You may find that you want to do hyper-local marketing. And while you've got a CRM database with email addresses, you can see your web analytics that shows you behavioral information on the website, maybe you learned that you need to capture device IDs so that you can set up geofencing and really get down to the hyper-local level. That's a new data source that you need to collect, and you need to understand all of that. Additionally, you need to think about, how are you protecting personally identifiable information and complying with GDPR regulation? These are big questions about how do you safeguard and understand what you have. When it comes to architecting your data, understanding what connections and APIs you have, talking about who's responsible for data quality, accuracy, and governance, where does the data flow from one platform to another, and then how do you establish those metrics and KPIs so that you know that you have data that matters. And then the third point, activating your data. This is really where the rubber meets the road here. So when we talk about activating your data, one of the key principles here is communication. If you hoard your data and keep it all to yourself, your organization is not learning. So what communications do you have for sharing that data? Whether it's a daily stand-up meeting, a weekly report, a monthly analysis that you deliver, how do you make sure that the right people get information that they need to do their jobs? In a similar way, when you think about other things, what data can trigger automated actions? Maybe you see people visiting certain sections on your website of content, and they do it multiple times. Maybe that's the right opportunity to approach them or send them an outreach that says, hey, I understand you're interested in this. Let's tell you more about it. Activating the data is really where this comes alive and being able to use all of this data with purpose. And that's ultimately what you're working towards. So I'll give a little teaser. We're going to have a blog post that's going to come out in the next couple of days that we'll get into your hands. But really the best practices around these questions and how to ask them and challenge yourself, do you have a sustainable data strategy? So Paul, back to you.
Thank you very much, John. We hope you all enjoyed the webinar today and learning a little bit more about holding your marketing to a higher standard and then getting some of the insight about how do you actually go about building that infrastructure and setting the plan that will help you get there and be a more effective marketer. We'd encourage you to share your questions. We saved about 9 or 10 minutes of our time to answer any questions that you have.
And we do have a couple questions that have come in. Paul and John, the first question is, what about the marketers at the local level that have a mix of digital and traditional? How does this all apply?
It's a great question. It's actually a lot of what we deal with. Many of our clients are, as I mentioned, that enterprise to local. So they're part of a large organization, but they may have budgets, goals, or objectives at the local level. And we always see that mix of digital and traditional. If you remember the slide that I showed you of the map, we're wanting to touch people at multiple points throughout their journey, and there's absolutely a mix. And one of the things that's a challenge in that is when you mix in traditional, a lot of times you have blind spots in your data. You lose visibility to the impact that's had in driving your marketing. And so we're leveraging technology as an opportunity to try and bring more accountability and transparency to that. One example, take your traditional out-of-home billboard. One of the things we've done is geofence those locations. So as cars pass through or people walk by, we're able to capture device IDs and then ultimately measure whether those people who saw that signage made it into that physical location. So it's an exciting time where we're able to layer digital on top of traditional to ultimately make it more accountable and more visible.
And I love that example because that's just all about the data, right? So you're understanding, who's seeing your billboard, actually tracking them into the store. I mean, that's data, using it with great utilization. That's a good example.
Thank you, guys. We've got one more here, and it is, where is the line between using data for good and still marketing effectively?
John, you want it or me?
Well, it is a fine line. So when you think about that, for me, what it comes down, data for good can be used in lots and lots of different ways, but it comes down to transparency and consent. So being able to tell your prospects, your customers, the people that you're marketing to, what's going on, what you're doing, and get their consent to be able to market to them, that's one of the fundamental things there. But it's a fine line. It's the ability to understand kind of where that line exists and not to overstep your bounds. Because nobody likes creepy marketing. That's just not the way that you're going to succeed or take your marketing to that higher level. So a lot of it comes down to that transparency and consent.
And one last question that we have here. They say, this all sounds great, but how do we test into it?
So I think if I'm interpreting the question correctly, it's some of the things we've talked about today have piqued your interest or things that you're ultimately thinking about, but like most aren't ready to necessarily jump in and have blind faith. And the nice part about this is you don't need to. So ultimately, much of what we've talked about today are things that have definitive proof points to it. I mentioned earlier with some of these new capabilities, we can actually charge on a cost per visit basis, which means instead of a traditional like agency fee of a percentage of spend or something like that, we can agree upon a cost per visit value that says, for $10 per person that I drive into your physical location, that's what the cost would be, and you can actually work the economics of that. You can, if you know your in-store or your in-office conversion rate and your average order size, you can really figure out what's working for your business. And so this very much is something that you can, in fact, test into or take small bites of as you as an organization or a marketer start to move into this direction. It doesn't have to be a complete jump into the pool.
Okay. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, John. And thank you, everybody, for attending today. You'll receive an email link to today's slides and the webinar recording and other helpful materials supporting our topic. We hope the information Paul and John presented will help you to market more efficiently and precisely through the use of data intelligence.